We're Compound Everything, and we talk money, markets, and investing. We are two self-taught investors, and we also happen to be married, and we are passionate about the market and all things money.
That's right. So what are we actually talking about today?
Okay, today we are actually going to value two companies. You did one, and I did one. And originally we weren't going to tell each other what they were, but I can't keep a secret, so I blurted mine out a few days ago.
And you guessed mine.
And I guessed yours. So why don't you start with yours?
Okay, so you said value, and you'll see in a minute that, well, maybe about 10 minutes after I'm done my pitch to you, that the valuation on this one was hard. So the stock that I'm going to discuss, maybe not pitch because I'm not sure if it's a buy or not, is a stock called TKO Group Holdings, which is basically, for you don't know, is a recent amalgamation between the UFC, or Ultimate Fighting Championship, and WWE, which is World Wrestling Entertainment. So they've come together and merged.
Now, how did you come to pick such a interesting company?
Well, firstly, I like the ticker. Ticker's awesome.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, so TKO means technical knockout.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a boxing martial arts term. Anyway, I've been heavily involved in martial arts pretty much my whole life. So I love martial arts. I've watched UFC ever since it started. And so it's just a company that's long intrigued me. And now our kids are into UFC and things like that. And so I think from that standpoint, I've noticed it's had a pretty good run. So why did I choose TKO? Well, firstly, martial arts have long intrigued me. I've been practicing martial artist for most of my life. So from that standpoint,
you were 7, I think.
yeah.
5
So
or 7
yeah, and I'm a lot older than that now.
Yeah.
So martial arts has long intrigued me. I followed the UFC since almost its inception.
UFC 2?
The first one I ever watched was UFC 2, which kind of dates me some because the first UFC was actually 30 years ago. A little over now, actually.
Yeah.
So it dates me a little bit. But the UFC and mixed martial arts has long intrigued me. And I also noticed that they've kind of had a bit of I don't want to say an explosion in popularity, but an increase in popularity lately.
Definitely.
Our kids have recently become interested. Our kids are teenagers to early 20s, and they've started to become interested in MMA. And
they've always been interested in martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and part of that is a product of their environment that they were raised in.
Yeah.
But they've recently really been interested in the UFC.
Yeah, and the funny thing is they're starting to host parties, and their friends who are not really into martial arts are coming and enjoying it, and so I thought,
We're seeing it more on social media.
We're seeing it more on social media, and so I thought, maybe there's something to this. And so that's really what kind of piqued my interest in looking at TKO as an investment, thinking that maybe there's something to that run-up. So again, TKO is now a merger that's happened between WWE and UFC. So previously, the WWE was actually an independently listed company. I didn't dig deep into and I probably should have done that for the purpose of this video, but the research was just taking me a long time. So I didn't get quite that far back in terms of the WWE, but that's been around as well since probably the 50s in terms of its history. Mm-hmm. So in terms of these two entities that have merged, one of the things that we like to look for is a long operating history. And certainly these two companies separately fit the bill. UFC being around for 30 years, WWE, which is formerly several other things, has been around since, arguably the 50s. There's a few name changes, this, that, and the other thing. And interestingly, actually, the WWE, I don't know if you know this, but has been kind of in the McMahon family ever since its inception.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was initially founded by...
a family
Yeah,
business.
It was a family kind of run and owned business, we'll say, until it was listed publicly, and up until, relatively recently. And so it was either Vince McMahon's dad or Vince McMahon's grandfather who actually started the company. And so it's been kind of in the McMahon family kind of ever since. And now there's different leadership, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I thought that was interesting because you've got these two companies, long operating history, fairly popular. I would say UFC has been increasing popularity. I'm not so sure about WWE. I've never, well, not say never. As I was a kid in my maybe early childhood, teenage years, I was always interested in.
So I actually loved
WWE.
The WWF.
Oh, so did I, yeah.
It wasn't WWE. So when I was younger, the WWE was actually like the lame one.
Right.
Right? And the WWF had all like the characters you wanted to. And I call
Hulk
them characters
Hogan
because they're actors.
Yeah.
But I remember my brother and I on Saturdays like that. We looked more forward to watching the
Wrestling.
WWF than we actually did to watching the cartoons.
Oh, totally.
Right? And yeah, and so this is like way back in the 80s at some point.
Yeah.
And, you know, then you just lose well, like for me, maybe it's being female, maybe it was age, but I just lost interest as I entered teenagehood. But there were guys at my school, my middle school, they had the action figures. They had the cards. They were like, they were like full into fake wrestling. So like, I always say it's like a soap opera for men.
Oh, for sure it is. That's exactly what it is. And so I thought these characters, they have staying power, right? And so the WWE also has staying power. It's been around for forever. People like it. So I thought, oh, interesting. Let's look into this a little bit. So what is the company? How do they make money? That's the big thing that we're interested in as investors.
We want to make money.
We want to make money, right? So they have 4 ways essentially that they make money. Okay. So through media rights and content, through sponsorships, live events, and product licensing, basically. So what does all that break down to? So what do they do? So with respect to media rights, what does that mean? So it means basically that TKO Group will give licenses to various carriers to carry content. Okay. So that means they might license content to ESPN, which is one of them. Peacock is another one. Tencent actually is another one. Sony.
So it's like the NFL selling the rights.
Correct. And oftentimes, you know, and actually they just signed Netflix for a 10-year agreement.
Yes, I think I heard that.
Yeah, for the WWE. So WWE is going to be I think Netflix is going to be one of the exclusive carriers of WWE content.
Netflix is really stepping on, just to digress, Netflix has really been stepping up their game as far as like content goes, in my opinion.
For sure. And I think the reading the 10K from TKO, they kind of allude to that too. So Netflix and Amazon and Apple are all kind of seeking to race for content, I think, to justify keeping subscribers.
Well, Disney better be racing, because I have to say we never watch Disney Plus.
Disney's another one. And so I think Netflix, it makes sense for them. TKO expects spending from some of the streaming platforms to exceed like 20% compounded annually over the next several years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so there's some significant tailwinds there in terms of selling content and things like that. So that's the first way. They sell content to platforms like Netflix and whatnot, and they kind of distribute that to viewers. The other way is pay-per-view, and we know that all too well.
$79.99 every month or twice a month on our credit
sometimes
card.
Twice a month, right? Yeah. And so oftentimes they hold, TKO will hold 350 events per year.
Mm-hmm. And we buy all of them.
I don't know if we buy all of those, but we buy all the UFC ones. And
yes,
so
we don't buy the WWE.
No. But we 2 times a month we end up subscribing for a pay-per-view for UFC, and it's quite costly. At the end of the day, that's the first one. So it's not only pay-per-view, but there's also, for UFC specifically, there's also something called UFC Fight Pass. So
which one of our kids has?
Which one of our kids subscribes to, and that has other content. I think there's like almost like a reality show that's associated with that and whatnot. So that's media rights subscriptions and whatnot. And that's one way. The next one is live events, and that kind of goes without saying. So what's a live event? Well, whenever there's WWE events that they're gonna lease out a stadium and sell tickets and whatnot. Same thing with UFC. They'll have their events in Las Vegas and
those
other
tickets
places.
are expensive.
Those tickets are extremely expensive.
You looked into taking our 2 oldest boys,
to
or
Toronto.
middle boys, to Toronto to go see Sean Strickland in UFC. Can't remember which number it was. And first of all, we couldn't get tickets because they sold out so fast.
Yeah, it was nearly sold out.
And then how much and you were looking at the cheap tickets.
I was looking at kind of nosebleed tickets, and they're $800 a piece. Per ticket.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So it's not cheap.
No, it's not cheap at all.
In my mind, I haven't studied the company, but it really shows that there is a very voracious demand.
Oh, for UFC.
For UFC, that
Absolutely.
People are willing to spend that much and they sell out so quick.
Yeah, especially for like large cards. Everyone wanted to see Sean Strickland fight again because he upset Israel Adesanya, and so that was a pretty big card. Yeah. I think from that standpoint, there's a pretty good amount of run rate there. Again, I haven't followed WWE so much, but again, they also have live events, and those are pretty well known. Thirdly, there's sponsorships. So what is that? Well, you can buy, I guess, rights to advertise within the programming.
Okay.
So, if you watch UFC, well, what's in the middle? Big monster symbol, right? So, and on the side, you may see Toyo tires or something like that. So there's another means of income along that way. And then fourth is just licensing of products. So that boils down to things like shirts and things that they might sell at live events. You alluded to earlier, toys. And so for WWE, I don't think anyone has a Sean Strickland toy or Israel Adesanya toy. So that's a fourth means of income for them. So that's the company. And the company now, as I mentioned before, one of the other things we look for is management. The current CEO of TKO is a man named Ari Emanuel. And so he's also the CEO of the company that, I guess, let's say, spun off the UFC, called Endeavor Group Holdings. So this is where it gets a little complicated, because the CEO of TKO is also the CEO of Endeavor.
And what's Endeavor?
Endeavor is actually the majority owner of TKO.
Okay.
After this whole split off. So what ended up happening is you got a new company called TKO Group, which formed from the kind of amalgamation of the UFC with WWE. So WWE was previously a separate company, and Endeavor Group held the UFC, and so they spun off part of that UFC part and acquired a 51% ownership stake of TKO, and the owners of WWE got 49.
Okay.
And so
Endeavor has the controlling.
Endeavor has controlling interest, and Ari Emanuel is CEO. And so he's actually, the funny thing with Endeavor is Endeavor's a company that does a lot of representation for athletes, and they do online sports betting. They're actually a fascinating company in and of themselves. So the funny thing is, and I'll get to this in a minute, one of the moats that I think that TKO may have is a bit of a network moat, in part because of what Endeavor can supply to them as well. So anyway, so
it's a good partnership.
So I think it's a good partnership. It's if you want to have a co-owner, that they seem to be one, like if you're going to jump into TKO and you want a co-owner, I think having Endeavor as a co-owner is not a bad thing.
Okay,
put it that way. So there's been a bit of a leadership shakeup as well, which is one of the reasons that TKO might have kind of done a little bit of a drop.
Which is partly what put it on your radar.
Which is
do that drop.
Yeah, which is one of the things that put it on my radar. Under the current leadership structure, you've got the CEO, and then the two companies will operate somewhat separately and report back to the management of TKO. So the president of UFC is Dana White. And he's done a very good job, I think, of promoting the UFC, getting MMA out there. And he's done that for the past 20 some odd years.
Yeah.
And so he's going to be a fixture.
He's responsible, in my mind, as to why the UFC today is exactly what it is.
Hands down, no question. I mean, he's a bit of a controversial character as well. I'll acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. But he's managed to do a very good job.
Fantastic. And he handled the whole COVID thing just spectacularly.
Yeah.
I don't know if another leader of a sports organization handled that as well as Dana White.
No, I completely agree. Like, he was finding fights and whatnot and programming for the UFC when it just couldn't be done elsewhere. So he was finding fights to promote and stuff like that, other places when it couldn't be done in the US. Basically, he kept the show going, which is what he needed to do.
Yeah, and I really think that because of how he handled that whole situation, the UFC just blew up even more.
Yeah.
I think Dana White should actually be studied as one of the greatest businessmen.
He's done a very good job. Yeah. So underrated for sure, for sure. And the funny thing is, he's not even on the board of directors.
Yeah, that was shocking to me when you told me that.
Which is crazy.
I have assumed he was.
Funny enough, though, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is. Yeah. He was just recently appointed to the board.
Also another fantastic businessman.
Also another great businessman. Yeah. And So the leadership shakeup actually happened in WWE with Vince McMahon. So Vince McMahon recently stepped down from leadership there because he was involved in a potential sex trafficking scandal, which really doesn't look good.
Yeah,
so hence, the company dropped. And I mean, that said, Vince McMahon actually arguably was also a very good promoter as well. I mean, in terms of promoting WWE and whatnot, I mean, he's been around since I was a kid.
Oh yeah.
So it's unfortunate. I don't know all the allegations. I mean, some of them sound somewhat legit. So I mean, that's a bit of a stain. But having said that, I think that's why it dropped. So the new president is a gentleman named Nick Khan, and I think he's been there a while, but I didn't have much time to study him. So again, I was more interested in the UFC part of things.
Yeah, I know.
So I mean, one of the things that's done looking into this company is reflected on somewhat of the difficulty it is to study companies. You got to go into a lot of the history, figure out who
hours.
Hours and hours. I probably spent 20 to 30 hours
at least.
diving
And then
into
you're
this
always
company.
thinking about
Yeah.
it, right? And then you're
Yeah.
like, oh, I want to look into this. Like
Yeah.
it's 20 hours reading, but then you're also like pontificating and putting
Yeah.
your thoughts together and writing them out.
Oh, for sure. And I think I've just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
I think I probably need to at least triple the amount of time to do it justice.
You picked a more difficult company.
That said, I did, because there was this recent merger, and you know the financials are not all there, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. So these are the leaders of the company. I think, again, going back, Mr. Emmanuel has done a great job of growing Endeavor, which is basically a representation company and whatnot, representing athletes and stuff like that. And Dana White's done a great job with UFC, so I think it's in pretty good hands. Again, can't comment on Mr. Khan, but same thing.
I'm going to digress for a second, but I really hope Dana White comes out with a book.
That would be good, actually.
I
I would
know,
read it if you
I
did.
know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So, next part, what is the moats?
Yeah,
what
what are the moats?
What are the moats for TKO? Well, I think the moats for TKO is pretty much brand.
Yep.
It's all about brand, I think, at this point. Well, not all about, but 90% of it, their moat is brand.
And maybe networking as they get bigger.
I was going to say that same thing, actually. So the brand is, there's two things. Well, it's UFC and there's WWE. So, I mean, what other wrestling organization is there other than WWE? I don't really know of any.
I mean, I don't follow
it, but if you said, what is WWE, I'd know in an instant.
And everyone would.
And most, if not everyone would,
Yeah.
right? They've got viewership in something like 150 countries. Yeah. It's all over the place,
Yeah.
right? Between actually UFC and WWE, they have something like 1 billion viewers.
Really?
Yeah, it's that big.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's shocking.
Yeah, and UFC, of course, is in something like 170 countries, and you know, again, they've got. If you say UFC, people know exactly what you're talking about, right? Now, having said that, and this is maybe one area where the moat's maybe not as deep with UFC as it was WWE. There's a fair amount of competition in the MMA space that I've noticed. Anyway, so there's like combat karate, there's K1, there's some other
One
Asian
champ?
leagues, one champ.
Is that one?
Yeah. So there's a few leagues that are maybe kind of gunning for some more eyeball time. And so that could potentially be an issue. But I think overall UFC is pretty well set. I mean, they have probably some of the most recognizable fighters out there, at least, you know, from my perspective. And so really it's about brand.
Yeah.
Network also, I think, is a bit of a moat for them. As I alluded to before, the majority shareholder actually is involved with, you know, promotion of celebrities and athletes and things like that. So if you got to have a business partner who's a majority owner, it's not a bad thing to have Endeavor on your side, who's representing these people.
Yeah.
And these people really are your product.
It's true. And
right?
That's how it is just for sports. That is just how it is.
That's just
for
how it is.
entertainment.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, we mentioned Sean Strickland a couple times. He's the product. Conor McGregor, he's the product. You know, like Sugar Sean O'Malley, he's a product. So, I mean, you're taking all these individuals and you're kind of, you know,
and they're brands within a brand.
And they're brands within a brand. That's right.
Yeah, and if they have strong, like these athletes are very important.
Yeah.
And the brands that their personal brand, I guess we call it, is very important because they develop a cult following. And as you know, I love cult companies.
That's right.
And so the UFC or the WWE, that might not have a cult following, but their athletes have cult followings.
Well, I mean, just as an aside, we had a little bet with our kids going on at one point. Who is the most recognizable?
It turned into a huge family fight.
It turned into a family argument.
Yeah.
So we said, who is the most recognizable Irish person? And their argument, we said Bono or U2.
Yeah.
And they said Conor McGregor.
Yes.
And at the end of it, I think Conor McGregor won out.
We had to agree that Conor McGregor was because they said, no, we didn't say band, we said person.
Yeah.
And so they said if you go up to random people of all different ages, they said it couldn't just be 40 and up.
Yeah.
It had to be all different ages. And you said, who's Bono? And you said, who's Conor McGregor?
Yeah.
And we had to come to the conclusion that Conor McGregor might actually be the more famous Irish man.
Yeah, even more than Bono, even more than the band. He has more followers on social media, and I think
we did a deep dive on that. We spent it was 7 people because our family is 5 kids plus us. We spent an entire evening all looking in and arguing over who was right.
So there's a definite moat there. The athletes are, you know, well known oftentimes. Well, can be. I mean, Conor McGregor's kind of like the Michael Jordan of the UFC.
Yeah, Conor McGregor is just I don't want to say the UFC wouldn't be where it is without him, but he really did help put the UFC on the map.
Yeah, he's probably the most recognizable athlete from the UFC.
I would
without
say
a
so
question.
too. Yeah.
I mean, there's that Netflix
that was
documentary,
probably a big part of it.
McGregor Forever. So
and he has a larger than life personality.
He really does.
Yeah.
he really does.
Yeah.
So those are the moats. What are the potential pitfalls? Again, I think WWE is in my opinion, I think it's kind of like a stable viewership. I don't see it having a large runway for growth.
Me either.
Again, I didn't go back into the previous, companies' financials, like separate companies' financials, too deep. But I think they're kind of stable, so I don't see a lot of growth in WWE. I do see a lot of growth potentially for the UFC. It's very popular in emerging markets like Brazil and some of the some Asian countries. Actually, even in places like Saudi Arabia, it's gaining popularity. And so I think from that standpoint, Russia, I think also it's gaining popularity there.
They have some big UFC fighters.
They have some very big fighters there. So I think from that standpoint, there's room to move.
I think one of the things that is interesting to me about the UFC is that you weren't even allowed to, America took a long time to get on board with it.
Oh, yeah.
And that is an interesting little bit of history
to
me.
When I first started watching, I remember there being press articles comparing it to human cockfighting.
Yeah.
Right? And so there was a big furor that we shouldn't be letting these guys go in there and basically beat the tar out of each other.
Even though it's like they're both there by will.
Oh, they're both there consentingly. And
there's already boxing.
Oh, yeah.
Fights in sports. I
didn't see the big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, they have changed the rules somewhat to make it maybe a little bit more palatable. There are some good rule changes and whatnot, but I won't digress there. So, long story short, I think UFC has room to grow. I think WWE may be kind of stable. But on the minus side for UFC is that there is some competition out there.
Yes.
They need to kind of continue to develop these athletes, get the best athletes. Yeah. They may lose market share to other organizations like One Champ, K1, and whatnot. So I think from that standpoint, that in and of itself is a little bit of a risk. So that boils down to what's it worth. This I've struggled on. Down to the nitty gritty. So here's the challenge when you're trying to value a company. What you're trying to look for is several years of financials, and you're looking for, ideally revenues that are increasing. You're looking for book value that's continuing to increase, hopefully, but that's not a make or break. And net income I like to see continuing to increase, and at what rate. Now the trouble is, the UFC and Endeavor Group actually was only publicly traded as of 2022, so I didn't have much data there. And the WWE was a separate company, and again, I didn't have time to go into their financials too deeply, and that's only half of it now. So I was left kind of cobbling together some numbers to try and find my best way to value this business. So
that's tough.
So what did I do? I used the management's estimates of free cash flow. Okay. So I'm going to give you a line from the annual report, the newly minted annual report for TKO. And it says the company is targeting adjusted EBITDA of $1.150 billion to $1.170 billion for 2024. And then they say the company is targeting free cash flow conversion in excess of 50%. See, what the heck does that mean? So that means basically they're hoping that those EBITDA numbers translate into at least 50%, greater than 50% free cash flow. Right. So I used those numbers and gave it basically a price to free cash flow estimate of what I think it could be worth, and I gave it a range. Okay. All right, so if you take those numbers, if you trust management, that's always the question, then you end up with a estimated free cash flow. If they're right, and at 50%, of the EBITDA turns into free cash flow, you got $558 million of free cash flow on the low end. And I thought on the higher end, if they got 55% free cash flow conversion, you'd end up with $644 million at the higher end at $1.170 billion. Okay, not sure if you follow the numbers, but take my word for it. And then at 8 times free cash flow, so let's say in the future, if you take 8 times free cash flow, and that you end up with $4.464 billion as a market.
What is their market cap now?
So their market cap right now is $6.78 billion.
And what was the number you said you would get?
$4.464 billion. And so if you take at the higher end though, if you take the $6.44 million as being the free cash flow at a 55% conversion, and if you take 15 times free cash flow as what you'd be willing to pay for the company because it's growing, you get 8.660 billion as a market value. And so if you divide that by the number of shares, on the low end you get $53 a share for TKO, and at a high end you get $116
so that's quite the
per
range.
share. You get quite the range. So again, this...
Now what's it trading at? What's it at around today?
So as of today, it's trading at about $81 per share. So that it's either trading above or below intrinsic value, somewhere in there.
So if you were to put money in it, because we don't have a position, I don't think you have a position.
I do not have a position.
Would you feel comfortable, and what would you use out of those two numbers?
That's a good question. Honestly, I gave a range of estimates in terms of price to free cash flow. It would really depend on the multiple that people are willing to pay in the market. You know, honestly, I think for a company, if it was going to grow as I thought it would, I'd probably use the higher multiple as being fair, 15 times free cash flow, because if they can continue to grow that, you know, it'll make a lot of sense to me.
Wall Street will jump on, investors will jump in and push that up.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is, if you're interested in, you know, jumping into the UFC, that's the kind of the pure play into this sector. If you want a less pure play, what you would do is go buy Endeavor Group.
Yeah.
Because they're majority owner.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is they actually do have more stable revenue, and they're going to be participating in the upside, and potentially the downside of anything that happens with TKO. So from that standpoint, that's another option there for anyone who may be interested. So that's another way to kind of play this is to look actually into Endeavor Group Holdings itself. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do on this one yet. It's probably one I'm going to continue to watch for a little while and see. Again, because I can't nail down a good valuation. That gives me a pretty wide range, but I had to give it a number.
Yeah.
You know, as Ashwath Damodaran would say, he's like, you know, these have to translate into numbers, and so
it can't just be a story.
It can't just be a story. The story's you got to give the story a number, and that's you know, those are the numbers I give it.
Okay, so that was a super interesting dive into TKO.
I had fun doing that, to be honest with you. I had a lot of fun doing that, and trying to usually I use a DCF method to value businesses, not a price of free cash flow. I even tried doing owner earnings. I couldn't do that either because I didn't have enough information.
Just not enough back history yet.
There's not enough back history, and the other part of the problem was the financials. Because the merger happened on September 12th of 2023, all of the year-end numbers include the whole year of UFC, right, numbers, but only include around 3 months of the WWE. So you've got to make too many assumptions and projections, and it wasn't clear.
And the more assumptions and the more projections you make,
the more muddy your numbers are.
You're not quite accurate.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was going to do my company, but that took quite some time.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it was good. I was just totally interested in it, so that was really good. I'm going to do my company next week.
Okay.
And so we'll pick up from there. If you can like and subscribe this video, that would be great because it helps our channel.